I want you to picture this. Sicily, 2011. I'm a naval flight officer. On deployment, it's somewhere between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. and I'm in front of a laptop, watching a guy scream at an NES cartridge in his basement. That guy was the angry video game nerd, James Rolfe, and the man behind the nerd just published his first horror novella. I read it, and I've got thoughts. Hey, welcome back to Fireside Writer. I'm TJ Stecker, crime fiction author, former naval aviator, attorney, and the guy who's been watching James Rolfe since I had actual free time while on a flight line in Sicily. If you're new here, this is a channel for serious writers who want to study craft, understand the genre, and build something that lasts. So hit subscribe and ring the bell. I put out new content every week. Alright, let's talk about Gnome Cave. For the uninitiated, James Rolfe is the creator of Angry Video Game Nerd, one of YouTube's foundational series. He launched it in 2004, went viral, and spent the next 2 decades building one of the most dedicated fan bases in internet history. He studied filmmaking at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia. He's made a feature film. He published a memoir in 2022, and in 2025, he released Gnome Cave, a horror novella adapted from a screenplay he realized he'd never have the budget to film. Here's why that origin matters for us as writers. His background as filmmaker, critic, horror obsessive, retro gaming archivist, and internet personality. That is a genuinely strange and specific cocktail of experiences, and Gnome Cave is soaked in all of it. I talk a lot on the channel about your background being your superpower as a writer. My background draws in flying anti-submarine missions over the Atlantic, from arguing procurement contracts in the Pentagon, from traveling through the mountains in North Carolina. That specific combination of experiences is something nobody else has. It's the same with Rolfe. Nobody else could have written this book because nobody else has this same particular mixture of influences, which includes, honestly, a career of analyzing why stories fail. That last part is crucial, and we'll come back to it. Here's the setup. 30 years ago, a kid named Dante rode a notorious theme park ride called Gnome Cave. At the end of a ride was a dragon, so terrifying that kids refused to confront it, and the attraction was eventually shut down. Dante chickened out, and he's never gotten over it. Now, decades later, he returns to the ride with his friends, and they decide to finally finish what they started, finally confront that dragon. But what they find there is more sinister than any childhood fear. That's the pitch, and that's a good one. Shades of Stephen King's It energy. The idea that something from childhood is still out there, waiting. Abandoned amusement park horror, and adults are forced to reckon with the versions of themselves they left behind. But here's the one thing I want to push back on. The way this book has been labeled. Most reviewers have been calling it horror. And yes, there's horror in it. But strip the genre trappings away and look at what's actually happening. A man's obsession with his past drives him to commit violence. His entrapment and nostalgia corrupts him, isolates him, and ultimately makes him dangerous. There are victims. There are consequences. Gnome Cave is a crime story. Dante is both the victim and the perpetrator of a psychological unraveling that ends in blood. That's not horror for horror's sake. That's the anatomy of how a person breaks, which is, when you think about it, what the best crime fiction is always about. Let me give you a straight take, because I think there are real lessons here, both from what works and what doesn't. What works? The premise is mythic. Returning to a place of childhood failure, trying to rewrite your own history. That's emotionally true in a way that requires no explanation. Rolfe also made a smart choice with Dante. We piece his backstory together in fragments, rather than getting it all up front. That's good instinct. It keeps you reading. The thematic core is also interesting. Rolfe has spent an entire career wrestling with nostalgia, loving old games and films, while also being honest about their flaws. He built a fan base on that tension. And Gnome Cave, he's weaponizing it. The dragon Dante couldn't face isn't a monster. It's the moment he stopped believing in himself. That's crime fiction psychology dressed in horror clothes. But here's what doesn't work. The book's origins and screenplay are visible throughout. You can feel the scene transitions. Supporting characters don't get much room to breathe. One character's entire backstory gets handled in about 30 words. And in short form work, that's a problem, because every page has to earn its emotional weight. There are also point of view shifts that come out of nowhere and pull you out of the story. Critics have been divided, some pointing to structural issues and others being genuinely entertained. My honest take, this is the first novel from a person with a background in visual storytelling, and some of that strength didn't translate clearly onto the page. That's not a knock on Rolfe. It's the reality of what happens when you change mediums. I have a law degree and thousands of hours of flight time. When I sit down to write a courtroom scene or an aircraft cockpit, that stuff flows. When I write something outside of my direct experience, I feel the effort. Rolfe feels it, and we feel it as the readers here. But that's actually kind of reassuring for us. So here's what I keep coming back to when I read Gnome Cave. James Rolfe's background is a specific mix: horror film obsession, retro gaming culture, deep love of practical effects in B-movies, and 20 years of analyzing when stories succeed or fail at an audience level. That is a remarkable set of tools for a storyteller. The problem isn't the toolkit. The problem is some of those tools don't translate directly into prose fiction without adjustment. His sense of what's scary is cinematic. The way a camera lingers, the way a score builds, the way an actor's face tells you what dialogue doesn't have to. None of that exists in prose. In prose, you have to build that tension through sense and rhythm, through what a character notices, through what's left unsaid. What does translate beautifully from his background is his thematic instinct. Rolfe has spent a career analyzing why nostalgia traps us, why we keep going back to things that disappointed us, why we can't let go of the past. And that's precisely what Gnome Cave is about. Dante's crime, because it ultimately is a crime story, is that he let the weight of one unresolved moment define his entire life. That's not a horror premise. That's a character study. That's crime fiction's oldest engine, a wound that festers until it causes damage. That resonates with me. Jefferson Coburn in Redacted is chasing his uncle's ghost through military cover-ups because he can't accept that some questions don't get answered. Jolene in The Moth is fighting the past because stopping means confronting what she's been running from. My characters and Dante are all haunted by the same thing: the refusal to let something go. James Rolfe didn't write a perfect novel, but he wrote his novel, drawn from a specific, irreplaceable combination of passion, obsession, and the creative experience. And underneath the horror trappings, there's a crime story about what happens when a man can't escape his past. That's worth reading. And for the writers, especially those of us still figuring out our own weird backgrounds and how they become the foundations for our work, it's worth studying. I watched James Rolfe on a laptop at a Navy base in Sicily, probably when I should have been sleeping before a mission. Years later, I'm writing fiction, and he's writing horror novellas, and we're both just trying to figure out how we turn everything we lived into something on the page. That's the job, and that's worth something. So if you want to pick up Gnome Cave, I think you should. The link's in the description. It's worth reading. And if you want to follow my own publishing journey, head over to tjstecker.com and sign up for my newsletter. So I'll see you next week by the fire. Make sure you keep writing.